morning, everyone. Just waiting for some more people to trickle in here. Happy Wednesday.
Yeah.
And welcome to our October edition of Coffee and Cargo. We'll get it into the agenda here in just a moment, but going to go over some brief introductions. My name's Emily Smith. I am a project manager here at Interlog, and today I'm joined by Justin Engelmeier, Vice President at Interlog, Ben Schwengel, International Operations Director here at Interlog, and Rachel Thielen, Marketing Director at Interlog. So welcome. We have a lot to discuss today. To kind of go over the agenda, we're going to talk about the timeline of industry events that occurred during the pandemic back in 2020 and all the way leading up to today. Diving into this summer and today's current market, also consumer and holiday spending. And we'll kind of end with 2024 predictions and a few current events. So Ben, Justin, as we kind of go into this timeline here, in the last few years during the pandemic, can you guys kind of take us through that timeline and where we kind of started back in 2020 and where we're kind of at now?
Yeah, absolutely, Emily. So when we look back at 2020 and how that year started out and then COVID hit shortly after, it was Chinese New Year essentially, and Chinese New Year it's normally shut down for about 2 weeks. It ended up being shut down for 6-7 weeks, started opening up with some air freight. A lot of the PPE, the masks and stuff like that were starting to come out here, but realistically people weren't importing for over 2 months, and so their inventories started to get very low. They weren't getting goods, and so when that stuff started opening back up in the fall of 2020 and then going into 2021, there was a tremendous amount of pressure. And so that's when I think the capacity started to shift and everyone's trying to move everything and they couldn't get all the freight out that they needed. And that brought the rates skyrocketing up all through 2022. And then they started coming down at the end of 2022 and into 2023, where they bottomed out to lower than where they were before the pandemic. And I think the reason why we're bringing this up here and trying to go back over this for a moment is up until the pandemic, our industry was fairly consistent in the fact of it wasn't exactly on the specific date, but you could tell, when Chinese New Year's rates are going to go up a little bit. After Chinese New Year, rates are going to come down a little bit. Then they're going to start to come up, in the spring as people start moving into peak season and stuff like that, where you'll see your GRIs and your peak season surcharges and what have you. And then it starts to taper off in November. And in 2023, it's just been completely different, still from the effects of the pandemic and how our industry shifted over that time. And so you started seeing things like blank sailings and all kinds of stuff for carriers to create ways to get those rates back up because they're so low at the moment. So it's interesting, and we have a few graphs coming up here where we can show where it's currently at, and there's still debates as to what's happening even at the end of this year here. So it's kind of an interesting time. Ben, you have more you want to add in on that at the moment?
When I see this chart, I think about the changes in consumer spending, and we remember the real estate market became so hot, and also the way people chose to live, where to live. New construction was very expensive relative to the previous years, and people were changing where they're moving into single family homes or into condominiums, and that's continued now too. So why we haven't quite found our new norm, everyone can kind of identify with it. Perhaps they are changing their spending habits, but they don't know what they want to spend their money on or how much they can budget, or if they're going to be working entirely remote or hybrid or entirely in the office. Some of those things just haven't settled yet.
Yeah, it is interesting, Ben. When we look at, what a typical, and choose any demographic you want, but what a typical person would spend money on in 2019 versus all of a sudden 2020, 2021, 2022. And your typical individual that's working full-time somewhere is commuting, going into the office. And now all of a sudden, some of them aren't commuting. They're not spending any money on commuting. Some of them don't even need a car. it changed what they had money to spend on. And so it kind of flipped upside down as to what people were spending money on. And that shifted a lot of stuff, a lot of our industry as well, because they had to start ordering more personal products that people were buying, or as you're saying, home projects or home office renovations or all kinds of stuff. But yeah, it is interesting. And now you're looking at different stuff like interest rates and whatnot. And so people might be a little bit uncertain as to what next year looks like. So they might be a little more cautious on what they're buying and what they're spending their money on.
Understandably so. Live with uncertainty for 2 years like that. We're going to be cautious about what to settle into, especially as we talk about the inflation rates and high interest rates.
Yeah, so let's see. Yep, here we go. And here's a blank sailing. And Ben, if you could touch a little bit on this. I know we've spoken about it here before. Sometimes it's not always a big deal, but I feel like when it does hit and it does happen to customers, what can they expect and what can people do about it? If you could just go over a little bit about the blank sailings and where we're at with that today.
Yep. Quickly to define blank sailings, that's when an ocean carrier's regularly scheduled vessel rotation to call on certain ports in a specific order changes abruptly, where they may skip over a certain port. And the reasons for that right now are to limit their costs, or they don't have enough volume coming out of that specific port to justify arriving there. The next vessel in the rotation, arriving a week later, will typically call that port. So when there's a blank sailing with the carrier you're booked with, that causes a 1 week delay. Now, 1 week delay can kind of extrapolate through your schedule if you have transshipments. So if you're going from a small seaport to a larger one, and you miss the first vessel in the small one, you may miss the intended vessel at the transshipment point, the larger port. Or you just have 2 vessels you're counting on and you're doubling your chances of blank sailing. Now,
Right.
there's the Golden Week, right? Golden Week happened earlier this month, and there was a lot of vessels that just skipped the rotations because there wasn't the volume during that Chinese holiday. But then they kind of made up for it the next week. And then we'll see how that goes the rest of the season here. We're seeing some indicators of uptick in volume, perhaps like we had last year, but we'll be watching these blank sailing reports very closely to predict, to book accordingly, so we don't ever end up booking on a blank sailing.
And Ben, I know at times, operationally your hands are tied whether or not you're going to hit a blank sailing, but a lot of times you guys are moving through them and you're working to make sure that they don't hit a blank sailing. So you're jostling to go with a different carrier that's not going to have a blank sailing that week versus one that does. How difficult has that been? Is that ongoing, where you guys are continually sitting here moving a booking from one carrier to another on a weekly basis, or what's that look like from your perspective?
It's not overwhelmingly stressful. If you set a good routine, and like previous years, we just need to set expectations to budget in maybe perhaps a week buffer with customers, because especially in the case of those transshipments where you have 2 vessel schedules that you're trying to coordinate with, there's just double the chance of a blank sailing happening, and it's wise to budget for a 1 week delay. I think we're still right around 20-25% of regular schedules have a blank sailing, but being mindful of it has helped us greatly, just to avoid that uncomfortable conversation of, here's the delay, we built into the expectation, but it's still a delay. No one wants that.
Right. So it's almost a difference of setting expectations differently and saying, well, 85% of the time, this is how it's going to work. However, 15% of the time, if there are issues, this is where it could happen, and this is what that would look like.
That's right.
Something along that.
Mhm.
All right. Yeah, Emily, and then following the blank sailings here, we're talking about previously delays in communication, visibility and stuff like that, what we had issues during the pandemic versus what issues people are struggling with now at the moment here. There obviously were huge delays, which made operational staff sit here and have to over communicate over every single little step of the way, just because there were bumps and hiccups everywhere at the peak of the pandemic. And the visibility, again, sometimes certain carriers and stuff like that, we could show what we saw and what carriers are saying where things are, but the visibility wasn't quite as transparent as we would like it to be. And then also blank sailings, but I don't think there were really too many blank sailings at that point in time versus now.
I had a conversation with a client earlier this week and kind of brought me back to when the ocean carriers just wouldn't predict when their vessels would discharge at certain ports. MSC was notorious for it. Their ship would be outside of Long Beach and they'd have an estimated discharge date 5 weeks into the future. So there's completely unreliable if you're going off of your standard tracking or carrier portals. You had to work with a forwarder that had so many containers actually coming in to Long Beach that they could do their own analysis and say, okay, well, it's an MSC container. Last week's MSC vessel took 12 days, or somewhere between 10 and 12, to give the customers an idea of when they could actually predict the goods. And right now, we don't have that issue. It's just fun to kind of remember the struggles we've had in the past and how important visibility was then and how much is still needed now. We can have that tight window of 1 to 2 days much more reliably.
Well, and I think those of us forwarders and VOCCs that at that time during the pandemic made that transition and learned how to increase transparency, even when it was extremely difficult, to now carry that forward through during this time here. Sure, there's some people that aren't watching their freight like hawks, but I think that transparency is still very fruitful for a lot of importers, a lot of customers out there, still being able to know when their freight's coming in, where it's at, and getting some sort of transparency on what their options really are. You know, if they need something coming in for a specific time, what's that look like? What different options do they have? What different carriers? What different routings? So I think those of us that stepped up and became even better and better during the difficult times are still doing well now, that things have somewhat normalized here. Now, speaking of normalizing, this graph, this chart here, this is interesting. And we've spoken about this quite a bit here recently, Ben. You know, we're reading all these publications and stuff, where some are saying that we're going to start increasing freight coming up in November and December, which isn't normal. You know, it's not necessarily normal within our industry. But we're being told that, and I don't know, I'm not necessarily hearing that from a bunch of customers that they plan on importing more, but the amount of traffic or the amount of conversations from other customers is increasing right now, which I dare say is quite unusual. I think in the past, over the years, you know, if they haven't gotten stuff in right now, or they're not planning on the things that are in right now, and you're not working on something that's coming in right now, you're not hearing a ton from the customers. This is when they're starting to recalculate for, you know, next year, or make sure everything's in stores or whatever it is for them, versus working with a freight forwarder on more conversations and options of freight coming in. So it's pretty interesting, and it'll be interesting to see what happens coming up in November. What's your take on that, Ben?
I agree. We are hearing more conversations. To me, the conversations I'm having anyway, there's less retail goods. When you're targeting the holiday rush, you're thinking, I need to have it available on the shelves for Black Friday sales or after Thanksgiving, which means you need to have it off the ship sometime middle of November. Your absolute last departure date from the East Asia is somewhere around like November 6th, 10th. That's gonna be like your last vessel to really make those sales of retail goods.
And even that's pushing it.
That's pushing, yeah, but that's over promising to your customer, hopefully it arrives, and then you do make it in time for delivery before December holidays. But the conversations I'm having is not retail goods,
Mhm.
a lot of the industry sector. And I like that. It sounds like greater confidence than we've seen the previous quarters in those types of sectors. So I am staying optimistic that we'll see an increase in volume for the rest of the year. It's not just tied to the holidays. Back to what we were saying with there's not a norm yet. We haven't found those ebbs and flows 2023 and beyond.
Right, and I think it's interesting too to read all the contradicting messages out there at the moment. If you start talking about interest rates and companies where it's more difficult for them to borrow money to then buy more products to expand their business, or labor costs have gone up, and so people are still trying to manage that.
Mhm.
So on one hand, there's people talking all about that, and then on another hand, there's predictions that no, we're gonna grow through this short period here. So it's interesting, and yeah, like you, I'm optimistic, and I hope for the best, and I hope that companies are continuing to grow and work through this. It's an interesting time to hear both sides of it and not know exactly how it's going to work out, but yeah.
It's a nice next graph you have here, just showing that steady incline is count on 500,000 to 1 million more TEUs per year from 2010. But if you extend that trajectory out to 2023, we're short about 1 million containers this year. We'll see if it rebounds next year.
Yeah, and so what you're saying is if you took an average and you kind of removed 2021 and 2022, right? We shouldn't be down this much, but we are down a little bit as to where you would be if you were following that trend from 2019, 2020, and if 2021 were normal, 2023 should be up a little bit further than it currently is, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, here we have I guess we're reaching out here to see from you guys what your guys' opinions are. What do you guys think is going to impact you the most here? The interest rates or your staffing projections, whether that be you need more, less, or just the difficulties at the moment with staffing in general, or budget vulnerability in the sense of people being unsure as to what's going to happen over the next year, or inventory surplus concerns. We still, there's a lot of people out there that have high levels of inventory, and they're just not bringing as much in right now here, or they're only bringing in certain parts of their business, but not everything, because they have high levels of inventory.
You read multiple global publications on what the Chinese overextended in their real estate investment. They had quite a bit of concern how they're going to continue funding these projects so many years out, and they're not filling them. And the downturn in the economy this last year or so has hurt China incredibly. So perhaps their products will become more affordable, or perhaps certain suppliers of U.S. importers will simply just vanish, and they'll have to find alternatives, maybe at a higher cost. And all these little issues build into those 4 big ones that you just went over, perhaps in the budget vulnerability.
Yeah.
We're trying to stabilize with inflation and compensation for employees where they should be working. We allowed some people to go remote, and now many companies are trying to reel it back in. Trying to make sense of it. This 2023 has been a good year, but I think everyone would agree that we just haven't found that norm, and we want that feeling in 2024. So we appreciate anyone's that's listening right now to give some input on what you think will be impactful next year.
Right. I think a lot of that comes from the confidence in the consumer, right? And so when the consumers are confident in spending, that fixes a lot of these issues here. And that's when things start to turn around. Um, and while the rest of us can be as confident as we want, we still need that aspect there, and we need them willing to go out and purchase more.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben and Justin, for all that great knowledge. A few current events that we have for the week. Just before I go into them, we do send out a recap email tomorrow with a bunch of the topics that we went through today, and also more information on these current events. So make sure to look out for that. And if you ever want to kind of rewatch this, we do post it on YouTube, on our socials, and our website. So it is available on all those platforms as well. So current events that we have, I'll go over a little bit, but again, like I said, there'll be more information in our recap email tomorrow. But we're seeing increased prices in petroleum and natural gases due to the conflicts happening over in the Middle East. And then there's some cyber attacks that have been happening this year. We had one early July with a port in Japan that got hit. And it kind of disrupted some of their cargo packaging procedures over there. And then we had one actually just happen October 1st with SC's Express line, and they had a technical outage. So that's some things that we've actually been touching on a few of our newsletter pieces in Interlog Insights. So if you're curious about more information on that, reach out to us and we'd be happy to send some articles over. And then the Mississippi water levels still are pretty low, and actually they just reached a record low this last week. So we've seen some increases in barge rates, and actually a lot of them are running at half capacity right now. So that's just a few current events. Other than that, we'll close it out. And Emily, yep. So next Coffee and Cargo will be November 15th, 10 a.m. Central Time. We do offer a monthly webinar mailing list. I know a lot of you are a part of that. What that means is we actually just sign you up every month, so you don't have to do it. If you'd like to be a part of that, just email myself at rachel@interlogusa.com. But thank you guys for joining, and hopefully we see you guys next month. Thank you.
Thank you.